We are back for episode number 8 now of NHL Deal or No Deal. It's crazy that we're already 8 episodes in, but you guys continue to support this series and really enjoy it, so I'm going to continue to make them probably every second week. This was supposed to go up yesterday, but the power went out for a thunderstorm, so I wasn't able to upload, so I apologize for that. But now, let's not waste any more time, and let's jump right into this video. This first mock trade comes from Verizon Gaming, who says Laine for Dren, a first-round pick, and Noah Juleson. So this would basically be a sign-and-trade, or just trading the rights of Patrik Laine to the Montreal Canadiens, and obviously there has been a lot of rumors that Montreal was interested in offer sheeting Patrik Laine. In my opinion, I don't really think that any of this is going to happen. I think Laine is probably going to re-sign with the Winnipeg Jets. I think they want him there. I don't really think they're going to look to trade him. He's already shown he can be a 40 goal scorer at such a young age, and also that is a lot to give up for Montreal. So in my opinion, I'm not really the biggest fan of this trade for either side, so I'm going to have to say no deal. This next trade comes from Andy, who says Buffalo receives Anthony Mantha and Detroit receives Rasmus Ristolainen and a second-round pick. Now, me being a Red Wings fan, I don't really like this trade. I think Anthony Mantha can be a consistent 30-goal scorer in this league, and Rasmus Ristolainen is good, don't get me wrong, but in my opinion, he's not really as good as some people make him out to be. I don't really think he can be a number one defenseman on a winning team, and Buffalo has made steps to improving that blue line, so I think they could give him up in a trade like this, and I think this would be a pretty solid move for Buffalo. But me being a Red Wings fan, I think we should just let young guys like Dennis Cholowski, Moritz Seider, and Filip Hronek really take over that next generation of the blue line. So this might be a little biased. I don't really like this trade. I'm going to have to say no deal. Next mock trade comes from Juliko Gaming, hopefully I'm saying that correctly, who says Jesse Puljujarvi and a pick for Pavel Buchnevich. Now this would be an interesting trade. There is a lot of trade rumors around guys like Nemestikov and Chris Kreider and Pavel Buchnevich because New York is kind of in a cap crunch now after having such a busy offseason, and Pavel Buchnevich is an RFA that is most likely going to warrant, $4 million plus if he does get a deal done with the Rangers. I think he's a very solid player who has potential to be a 30-goal scorer. Hasn't really shown it just yet, so maybe New York does want to trade him. And getting Jesse Puljujarvi back, you're taking a risk on a young player, but it is a cheap player. He doesn't have a big contract, and that is what the New York Rangers need. They need some players on some entry-level deals and some cheap guys to come in and really contribute and fill out the depth of that lineup. So honestly, I actually like this trade, but I don't really think New York would be willing to give up Buchnevich for a guy like Puljujarvi, who we really have no idea what he's going to be at the NHL level. So I like the idea of this trade, and I think maybe if there was some tweaking here and there could be something done that looks like this, but for right now I think I'm going to say no deal. The next mock trade comes from Ross V, who says the Panthers acquire Ryan Nugent-Hopkins and the Oilers acquire Dadonov, Mulligan, and a second-round pick. Now I don't really think Florida needs a guy like Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. They already have a solidified number 1 and 2 center with Barkov and Trocheck, so Nugent-Hopkins would most likely be a third-line guy there, and I don't really know if that's a role you want him in. I think he's better suited in the top 6 role, and you'd be giving up a top 6 winger in Dadonov, who's been fantastic for you since coming over from the KHL. You'd be giving up a draft pick too, so I think I'm going to say no deal to this one as well, just because I don't really think Florida needs a guy like Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. I like the team that they have right now. The next one comes from Mr. Donkey, who says Buffalo receives Louis Eriksson and Vancouver receives Zach Bogosian. Now this would basically be just swapping bad contracts, but I don't really know if this is a deal that either team would want to do. I mean, Buffalo, you'd get a guy that's most likely going to play on your third or fourth line, wouldn't give you too much, and I think Zach Bogosian was actually relatively solid for Buffalo when he was healthy this past season. So in my opinion, I think Buffalo would rather just let it ride out and then eventually have Zach Bogosian come off the books as a UFA, because I think he's probably more valuable right now than a guy like Louis Eriksson, and Louis Eriksson's contract is also a little bit worse, so I think I'm also going to say no deal to this one from Buffalo's side. Next up, we have one from just a bunch of letters as the name, and it's Brian Rust and Nick Bjugstad for Gusev. Now, I think I'm actually going to say no deal to this one as well. I know I've said no deal a lot so far in this video, but I just don't really know what teams would be willing to give up for a guy like Nikita Gusev, who's never played an NHL game. We don't know how his game from Russia is going to translate over to North America, and Brian Rust and Nick Bjugstad are some really good depth pieces for the Pittsburgh Penguins, who, could play an increased role next season now with guys like Phil Kessel gone. So I think I'm going to say no deal to this one, just because I don't really know what Nikita Gusev's value is. The next one comes from DMP Beats, who says Boston acquires Zucker and Minnesota acquires Heinen and a first or second. I definitely think it would have to be Danton Heinen and a first round pick to get a guy like Jason Zucker. I know he's on a hefty contract and didn't have the greatest year, but he is more than capable of having a bounce back. In my my opinion, and being a 30-goal scorer, especially on a team like Boston where he'd be playing with some really good players. I think he would just fit in Boston, so salary cap aside, I know it would put Boston in a bit of a tough spot trying to re-sign McAvoy and Carlo, but I actually like this trade a lot, and I think Zucker would work in Boston, so I'm going to say deal to this one. The next trade comes from Islanders fan 13, who says Ehlers to the Islanders for Leddy and Kiefer Bellows. Now, Nick Ehlers, his name was in trade talks a little bit just because, Winnipeg wanted to shed some cap to re-sign guys like Connor and Laine, but in my opinion, for what Nick Ehlers can do, and I think he can be a 70-point guy consistently, a $6 million contract roughly around there, I think it's very good for him. I think that is a team-friendly deal, and I don't think the Winnipeg Jets really want to move out Nick Ehlers, and they would be improving their blue line getting Nick Leddy and would get a decent prospect in Kiefer Bellows, but I just don't really think it's too appealing for the Winnipeg Jets, so for that reason, I'm going to have to say no deal to this one. The next trade comes from Breadman Gets Paid, love the name, and they say Nemestikov to the Avs for a 2024th and a 2027th. Now, I don't know if that's quite enough to get a guy like Nemestikov. I know he's on a pretty bad contract, but I think he can still be a solid player, maybe like a 45 to 50 point guy. He's still young, and I think in a new situation like Colorado where he'd probably play third or second line minutes and get some power play time, I think he would fit well there, and even though he's on a bad contract, Colorado could afford to take it on because they have a ton of cap space, so I think maybe if this was like a second and a fourth round pick or like a third and a second or something like that, maybe something would get done there, but I don't really think a fourth and a seventh is enough to get a guy like Nemestikov, even though the Rangers probably want to unload his contract, so for that reason, I'm going to say no deal, but if it was like a second and a third, I think I would say yes to this one. The next trade, another Laine one from Lobby, who says Laine to Montreal for Carl Alzner, Paul Byron, Nick Suzuki, Noah Juleson, and a first and a second. I'm going to say no deal to this one right away from Winnipeg's side. I know you would be getting a lot back, but you really don't want to take on that Carl Alzner contract, especially when they are a team that is trying to shed some cap and, trying to re-sign their restricted free agents. And like I said earlier in the other Laine trade, I think Winnipeg wants to keep him around. I don't really think it's too appealing, put him out there on the trade market. So like I said, I think there'll be something done there, and this is a pretty big haul to get a guy like Laine, but you would be unloading that Alzner contract looking at it from Montreal's aspect, but I just don't really like this trade too much for either side, so I'm going to say no deal to this one. Next up, we have another trade revolving the New York Rangers, and this is a pretty interesting one. Chris Kreider and Nemestikov to Edmonton for Ryan Nugent-Hopkins and Jesse Puljujarvi. And like I said, New York wants to shed some cap, and Chris Kreider and Nemestikov and Buchnevich, all their names have came up in these conversations, and you would be getting a very solid second line center in Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, and a guy in Jesse Puljujarvi who could break out in a new situation. And for Edmonton, you'd be getting two solid wingers, and that is exactly what that team needs. So I actually love this trade for both sides, and I think Ryan Nugent-Hopkins would fill out nicely in that center position. Then you'd have a guy at center like Mika Zibanejad as the first liner, or Nugent-Hopkins. I think they're interchangeable, so Zibanejad and Nugent-Hopkins as your 1 and 2 guy I think are really solid, and I think New York's center position is probably what they need to improve on most if they want to win now. I know they have some young guys like Elias Anderson who can play center, Philip Hedl as well, but do you really want those two young rookies as your second line center when you're trying to make that jump and get into the playoffs? So I think Ryan Nugent-Hopkins would be a beautiful fit there. Puljujarvi, you never know what could happen with him, so I actually like this trade a lot. I'm going to say deal to this one. The next mock trade comes from Maple Tendy, who says Hoffman, Matheson, and a conditional second round pick turns to a first if Hoffman resigns to Philly for Shane Gostisbehere and Travis Konechny. Now, in my opinion, I don't really know if Philadelphia wants to give up a guy like Travis Konechny. Matheson is on a pretty hefty contract, and Mike Hoffman, if you want to bring him back, will probably warrant a lot of money as well. And you already gave a lot to a guy like Kevin Hayes. You have a lot wrapped up in Giroux and Voracek as well, so I'm not quite sure if Philadelphia would want to take that much money on and lose out on a really good young player like Konechny and obviously a solid defenseman in Ghost who had a down year but is more than capable of having a bounce back year and getting back to that 60-point guy that we once saw. So I think I'm going to say no deal to this one. It definitely is intriguing with some of the pieces in it, but just strictly because of the salary cap and stuff like that and Hoffman becoming UFA, I think I'm going to have to say no deal to this trade. So that is going to wrap up this episode of NHL Deal or No Deal, and I say this at the end of them, don't be too upset if your comment wasn't featured. There's going to be so much opportunity to have your comment featured in a video. Would you rathers, NHL agree or disagree, all that stuff, your comments can be featured, and I'm going to be doing these Deal or No Deals every second week right up until next trade deadline. So there's going to be so much time and so much opportunity, so don't be upset. Don't just go dislike the video because I didn't pick your comment. There's so much to go through. And also, I will be uploading a video tomorrow. I'm doing a collab with an Instagram account called NHL Collection, where I'm looking at some of your guys' bold predictions for next NHL season and giving you guys my thoughts on if I think they can actually happen. So look out for some pretty exciting videos in the future on the channel. Also, make sure to follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram as well. I'm starting to use that a lot, and just thank you guys so much for all the support lately. And with that being said, I hope you guys all enjoyed today's video. If you did, please make sure to drop a like on it and subscribe to the channel for daily NHL content, and I will see you guys all in the next video.